forced to marry a billionaire on his deathbed. His survival changed everything. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. The fluorescent lights of St. Jude's Hospital hummed above the quiet corridor. Clara Bennett adjusted the strap of her worn canvas bag, her hands trembling slightly. She had just finished a double shift, her body heavy with exhaustion, when the head nurse approached her with an unusual request. "There is a patient who wants to see you," the nurse said. Her tone was clipped, formal, as if this was not a simple bedside call. Clara frowned. She was just an ordinary nurse, barely keeping herself afloat with rent overdue, and her mother's medical bills piling higher every month. Why would anyone, let alone a VIP patient, specifically ask for her? She walked down the hallway, her sneakers squeaking faintly against the polished linoleum. At the end stood a guarded door, two men in suits stationed outside. They nodded curtly and pushed the door open for her. Inside, the room was nothing like the cramped wards Clara was used to. Plush leather chairs stood near the window, fresh lilies filled the air with their fragrance, and the beeping machines were state-of-the-art. On the bed lay Alexander Carter, the billionaire whose name had been splashed across every business magazine and news channel for years. But tonight, he looked nothing like the untouchable titan of Wall Street. His skin was pale, his frame frail, his breath shallow but steady. Clara froze at the doorway. She had only ever seen him on television, a powerful man who built empires with a single deal. Now, he looked broken, mortal, close to the end. "Come closer," his voice rasped, dry and weak, but still carrying authority. Clara obeyed, her heart hammering against her ribs. She stopped at his bedside, clutching her hands together. He studied her for a long moment, his sharp eyes dimmed, but not defeated. Then, with deliberate effort, he whispered words that made her knees nearly buckle. "Marry me." Clara blinked, certain she had misheard. "I am sorry, what?" "Marry me," Alexander repeated, stronger this time, though his voice cracked at the edges. "Think of it as a contract. You will not be left empty-handed. Your debts, your family, everything will be taken care of." Her throat went dry. Her debts, her family. The words hit too close. How did he know? She wanted to laugh, to run, to shout that this was insane. But the desperation in his eyes stopped her. "This is not about romance," he continued, his gaze locked on hers. "It is about legacy. I will not die alone, Clara, and in return, you will never struggle again." Her mind reeled. Hours ago, she had been a nurse counting coins in her pocket to buy groceries. Now, she was being asked to marry a dying billionaire. Her lips parted, but no sound came. The lily's perfume was suffocating, the monitors ticking like a countdown. In that moment, Clara understood that her life was about to split into two paths. And whichever one she chose, nothing would ever be the same again. Clara stumbled out of the private suite, her chest tight as if the walls of the hospital were closing in on her. The city beyond the window twinkled with careless lights, but she could not see any beauty in it. Her hands still shook from the billionaire's words. "Marry me." Think of it as a contract. She pressed her back against the cool wall of the corridor, struggling to steady her breath. A nurse walked past, glancing at her with mild curiosity, but Clara quickly looked down. She did not want anyone to see the storm raging inside her. All her life, Clara had fought against the tide. Her mother's illness had drained the family's savings long ago. The pills, the hospital visits, the oxygen tank humming beside the worn recliner at home each month pulled her deeper into debt. Her younger brother, Matthew, only 17, had dropped hints about quitting school to work part-time. She refused to let him. She had promised her late father she would protect him, keep his future intact, no matter what. But promises did not pay rent. Promises did not keep the lights on. The bills lay folded in the bottom of her canvas bag like silent bricks dragging her down. She knew that within weeks, the landlord would change his tone from polite reminders to legal notices. The hospital where her mother stayed part-time had already warned her that without payment, they would cut services. Clara had reached the edge of every cliff, and there was no more ground left. And then came Alexander Carter's proposal. She replayed his voice in her mind, cracked but still commanding. You will not be left empty-handed. Your debts, your family, everything will be taken care of. The words had struck like lightning, illuminating every hidden fear she carried. It was madness, she told herself. Marriage was sacred, not a transaction. She had never even spoken more than a handful of words to the man until tonight. Yet the image of his frail body against the white sheets, the hollowness in his eyes as he confessed, "I will not die alone," burned into her heart. He was a billionaire, but in that moment he looked more human, more vulnerable than anyone she had ever seen. The next evening, Clara sat at the tiny kitchen table in her mother's apartment, bills spread like cards in a losing game. Her mother, Eleanor, stirred weakly in her chair, pale but trying to smile. "You are too quiet, darling," her mother said softly. "What troubles you?" Clara swallowed hard. "Just work. Long shifts. I will figure it out." Her mother's gaze lingered, as if she could see through every wall her daughter built. Clara looked away, ashamed. She could not tell her mother that a dying man had asked for her hand in exchange for financial salvation. It sounded monstrous, like selling herself. But then Matthew burst into the kitchen, his backpack sagging with textbooks. "Clara," he said, dropping his voice. "The landlord came again. He says, if we do not pay by the end of the week, we are out." Her mother's face crumpled, and Clara felt her own throat tighten. The bills, the rent, the medicine, it was all collapsing at once. That night, long after they had gone to bed, Clara sat by the window staring at the city skyline. She thought about Alexander Carter's mansion that she had only seen in magazines, and about the way his eyes had locked onto hers in that hospital room. She thought about Matthew's future and her mother's fragile health. It was not a choice between dignity and love. It was survival. By the time the first light of dawn crept over the rooftops, Clara had made her decision. She would walk back into that hospital, face the billionaire again, and accept the impossible bargain. Not because she wanted his money, not because she dreamed of a glamorous life, but because, for the first time in her life, there was no other way forward. Clara returned to the hospital the next morning, with her heart pounding so loudly she feared the guards outside the suite would hear it. She wore her plain nurse's uniform, the fabric worn at the elbows, her shoes scuffed from too many double shifts. She told herself that she would be calm, that she would think this through like a professional. But as soon as the heavy door shut behind her, the air in the private suite seemed to press down on her. Alexander Carter lay propped against pillows, an oxygen tube at his nose. His skin was still pale, but his eyes were sharp. He watched her enter as though he had known she would return. "You came back," he said, his voice rough. Clara clasped her hands in front of her. "I came because I cannot ignore what you asked me." He tilted his head, studying her. "You have decided then?" Clara's breath trembled. "Yes, but I need to understand exactly what this means." A faint smile curved his lips. With a flick of his hand, he gestured toward the small table beside his bed. A leather folder rested there. Clara stepped forward, hesitant, and opened it. Inside was a document, thick with clauses, typed in crisp black ink. At the top, marriage agreement. Her throat tightened. She skimmed the pages, her eyes catching on the cold, legal language. She read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. Clause 1. This marriage shall remain valid until the death of Alexander Carter, or until otherwise mutually dissolved. Clause 2. The spouse agrees to participate in public events as requested. Clause 3. This marriage does not imply romantic obligation. She looked up at him, horrified. This is a contract, a business transaction. Yes, he said evenly. That is exactly what at Island. Clara wanted to run, but her mother's face flashed before her eyes. Matthew's backpack with the frayed straps, the landlord's threats. She forced herself to keep reading. At the bottom, space waited for her signature. Alexander's hand shook slightly as he reached into a drawer and pulled out a velvet box. He opened it, revealing a simple band of gold. This is not a token of love, he said. It is a seal. a symbol that you are no longer alone, and neither am I. Clara's breath caught. The enormity of the choice weighed on her. But she lifted the pen anyway. The scratch of ink on paper sounded louder than her heartbeat. When she looked up, Alexander was watching her with an intensity that made her chest tighten. "It is done then," he whispered. The door opened, and a man in a dark suit stepped in. He was Alexander's lawyer, his presence calm but brisk. Without preamble, he began arranging the documents, stamping them, sealing them into an envelope. "Congratulations, Mrs. Carter," he said softly. The words hit Clara like ice water. Mrs. Carter. The title belonged to her now, not out of love, but out of necessity. That evening, Alexander insisted they conduct a private ceremony in the hospital's chapel. It was small, dimly lit, the air smelling faintly of old wood and candle wax. Only the lawyer, a notary, and 2 of Alexander's aides attended. Clara wore her nurse's uniform still, her hair tied back in a simple braid. Alexander, frail and pale, stood with the help of his aides. The vows were brief, recited without flourish. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Clara felt the ground tilt beneath her. Alexander turned to her, his hand trembling as he slipped the plain band onto her finger. His lips curved into a thin smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Welcome to your new life, Mrs. Carter." Clara forced a smile in return, though her stomach twisted. She was now bound by law, bound by promise. She thought of her mother asleep in her chair, her brother clutching textbooks, and told herself it was worth it. But deep inside, a voice whispered that she had just stepped into a story far bigger and far more dangerous than she could imagine. The rain fell hard the night Clara arrived at the Carter estate. The cab's headlights swept across towering iron gates before they creaked open, revealing a long driveway lined with ancient oaks. Her stomach tightened as the car rolled forward. Beyond the trees, the mansion emerged like a monument, its stone facade glowing pale under the storm. The building was enormous, its columns rising toward the sky, its windows dark as if holding secrets. Clara pressed her forehead to the glass, clutching the strap of her canvas bag. She had seen houses like this only in magazines or on television. Now, she was about to walk inside as Alexander Carter's wife. The thought seemed absurd, almost cruel. The cab stopped at the front steps. A butler with a stiff posture hurried out with an umbrella. "Mrs. Carter," he greeted her, his voice smooth but distant. The title still felt foreign, like a costume she was unprepared to wear. Inside, the foyer glowed with chandeliers dripping crystals. Marble stretched beneath her feet, polished to perfection. A grand staircase spiraled upward, framed by portraits of solemn ancestors. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and wealth. Alexander was waiting, seated in a leather chair near the fire. His thin frame was wrapped in a dark robe, his features pale but sharp in the flickering light. "Welcome home," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Clara lowered her head slightly. "It is overwhelming." His lips curved faintly. "You will adjust. This house is large, but it does not have to feel empty. My staff will guide you." A housekeeper appeared, bowing politely before leading Clara down a hallway lined with gilded mirrors. She opened a door to a vast bedroom, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking manicured gardens. The room smelled faintly of lavender, the bed dressed in silk sheets. It was more luxury than Clara had ever known, but it felt cold, untouched by real life. "This will be your room," the housekeeper said. "Dinner is served at 7. Left alone, Clara dropped her bag on the polished floor and stood still, staring at her reflection in the mirror. A plain nurse in worn shoes, standing in a palace. She traced the gold band on her finger, the weight of it pressing down heavier than stone. At dinner, the long mahogany table seemed to stretch forever. Alexander sat at the far end, impeccably dressed, despite his frailty. The meal was extravagant filet mignon, truffle potatoes, and a glass of wine that probably cost more than her monthly salary. Clara sat stiffly, unsure of how to hold the silverware. "You look uneasy," Alexander observed. Clara forced a small smile. "This is very different from what I am used to." He cut into his steak with surgical precision. "You will learn. You are Mrs. Carter now. Appearances matter." She swallowed hard, nodding though her chest ached. The following days blurred into a strange routine. Clara was escorted to fittings, where stylists measured her for gowns. Tutors coached her on etiquette, how to hold a wine glass, how to greet business partners, how to smile without showing nerves. She stumbled often, her mistakes met with polite but sharp corrections. At first, she felt humiliated, but slowly, something shifted. When she laughed at herself instead of blushing, the staff warmed. When she answered a practice question with honesty rather than rehearsed lines, even the stern etiquette tutor raised an eyebrow in approval. One evening, she caught Alexander watching from the doorway as she practiced balancing a book on her head. His lips twitched as though hiding a smile. "You are not as clumsy as you think," he murmured. Clara flushed, startled by the softness in his tone. For the first time, he did not look like a dying billionaire forcing her into a contract. He looked like a man, quietly amused, quietly intrigued. Later that night, Clara sat at her window, sketchbook in hand. The gardens stretched silent below her, lit by the glow of lanterns. She traced lines on the paper shapes of faces, of emotions she could not say aloud. The world had thrust her into a life she had never asked for. Yet somehow, in the middle of the storm, she felt a strange flicker of belonging, and she wondered, just for a moment, if this arrangement was truly only about survival, or if something deeper had already begun to take root. The first major test came sooner than Clara expected. A week after moving into the Carter estate, Alexander's aide informed her that she would be accompanying her husband to a charity gala downtown. It was the type of event Clara had only glimpsed through television screens, polished limousines, flashing cameras, glittering gowns. The very thought made her palms sweat. On the night of the gala, the stylist zipped her into a midnight blue dress that shimmered faintly under the lights. Diamond earrings, borrowed from the Carter vault, brushed her neck. When she looked into the mirror, she hardly recognized herself. Gone was the tired nurse with worn shoes. In her place stood a woman who could belong to the glittering world of the elite, at least in appearance. But inside, Clara's stomach churned. The limousine ride was silent except for the hum of the engine. Alexander sat beside her, his expression unreadable, his frame thin but dignified in a tailored tuxedo. Clara clasped her hands in her lap to hide the trembling. At the gala entrance, photographers called out Alexander's name. Flashes erupted, illuminating his pale face and her nervous smile. He leaned slightly toward her. "Stand tall," he murmured. "You are Mrs. Carter. Let them see it." Clara swallowed hard and followed his lead, stepping onto the carpet as if she belonged. Inside, chandeliers bathed the ballroom in golden light. Waiters carried trays of champagne. Laughter echoed off the marble columns, and every corner glittered with wealth. Introductions blurred together CEOs, politicians, philanthropists, each extending polite smiles before turning their attention back to Alexander. Clara nodded, murmured thank yous, tried to keep her posture straight. Her heart raced with every glance, every whispered comment. She felt like an actress on the wrong stage. Then it happened. A journalist with sharp eyes and a sharper smile approached, microphone in hand. "Mrs. Carter," he said loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "There are rumors circulating that your marriage to Mr. Carter was unconventional. Some say it is more of a transaction than a union of love. What do you say to that?" The room stilled. Heads turned. Alexander's jaw tightened. But before he could speak, Clara stepped forward. Her cheeks burned, but her voice found strength. She looked directly at the reporter. When a man lies in a hospital bed, fighting for every breath, the last thing he thinks about is money or power. He thinks about who will stand by him when the world falls away. If being by his side, even for a short time, makes me a fool, then I will wear that title proudly. For a beat, silence hung heavy. Then someone clapped. Another followed. Soon the room filled with applause, polite at first, then genuine. The journalist lowered his microphone, caught off guard. Clara's pulse thundered in her ears. But she lifted her chin, forcing her shoulders back. She felt Alexander's gaze on her, intense and unreadable. Later that night, as the limousine carried them back to the estate, neither spoke at first. The city lights flickered across Alexander's face, highlighting the sharp line of his jaw. Finally, he broke the silence. "You surprised me tonight," he said quietly. Clara turned to him, her hands twisting in her lap. "I only told the truth." His lips curved faintly, almost a smile. "Perhaps, but you did it with more courage than most people in that room." Heat rose in her chest, though she said nothing. When they arrived at the estate, Alexander paused before stepping out. He looked at her with something softer than his usual guarded stare. "Thank you, Clara, for defending me." Her breath caught. "You did not need defending. You needed someone to remember you are human." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Maybe that is why I chose you." Clara stood frozen on the gravel path as he walked ahead, her heart racing for reasons she could not name. The contract had brought them together, but something unspoken, something fragile and dangerous, had just begun to stir between them. The night after the gala, Clara could not sleep. She sat by her window, sketchbook open on her lap, though the pencil hardly moved. Her mind replayed every second of the evening, the flashing cameras, the accusing question, and most of all the way Alexander had looked at her afterward. Not like a dying billionaire protecting his legacy, but like a man who had, for the first time in a long while, been seen. The days that followed carried a subtle shift. Alexander still kept his formal tone, still spoke in clipped sentences, but there were cracks in his armor now. Small moments. A softened glance when she entered a room. A hint of amusement when she stumbled over etiquette practice. He had begun asking her questions that were not about appearances or contracts, but about her. One evening, Clara found him in the library, a vast room filled with books that smelled of leather and dust. He sat in an armchair, a blanket over his legs, a glass of water on the side table. The firelight painted his face in warm hues, making him look less like the powerful mogul from the magazines and more like a man carrying quiet loneliness. "You spend a lot of time sketching," he said as she entered. Clara clutched the book to her chest, suddenly self-conscious. "It helps me think." "May I see?" he asked. His tone was not demanding, only curious. Hesitating, she handed it to him. He flipped through the pages slowly. Pencil drawings of city streets, her mother's worn hands, Matthew bent over his homework, and even the Carter estate, though drawn with hesitant lines. "These are good," Alexander said, his voice softer than she had ever heard. "You capture more than images. You capture feeling." Clara blinked, surprised. "No one has ever said that to me before. Perhaps no one has looked closely enough." He closed the sketchbook and handed it back. "You have talent, Clara. Do not hide it." "Oh." Her cheeks warmed. She sat across from him, the fire crackling between them. For a long moment, they said nothing. Then, almost against her will, Clara asked, "Are you afraid of what is coming?" Alexander's eyes flickered toward the flames. "Dying?" He let out a dry laugh, one without humor. "I am not afraid of that. Death is inevitable. What I fear is being forgotten. To build empires, only to leave nothing behind that matters." Clara leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "You are not nothing. Even if the world sees you as a name on the stock market, you are still you. That is worth remembering." For the first time, Alexander's composure faltered. His eyes glistened as though her words had pierced the walls he had built around himself. He turned his face slightly away, but his voice was thick when he spoke again. "You remind me that I am human, Clara. That is a rare gift." The silence stretched, heavy yet strangely comforting. Clara felt the space between them, narrowing, not with words, but with understanding. For the first time since signing that contract, she did not feel like a pawn in someone else's arrangement. She felt like a partner. Later that night, as she returned to her room, she caught her reflection in the mirror. The plain nurse who had walked into the hospital weeks ago seemed like a ghost. The woman staring back at her wore gowns, carried Carter's name, and held secrets in her chest that she dared not speak aloud. She touched the simple gold band on her finger, her heart racing. The contract had been clear. No love, no emotions, only appearances. But already, the lines were blurring, and Clara knew, deep down, that if she was not careful, she would fall for the man she had promised never to love. The warmth that had begun to grow between Clara and Alexander did not go unnoticed. In the Carter estate, walls had ears, and not everyone welcomed her presence. Rumors had begun circling even before the gala, whispers that their marriage was nothing but a scheme. Now, those whispers sharpened into knives. It started with small slights. A servant who once bowed politely now avoided her eyes. A relative at a luncheon let her hand hang in the air without returning her greeting. Clara forced herself to ignore it, but the unease gnawed at her. One afternoon, as Alexander rested in his study, his cousin Gregory stormed into the estate. Gregory was younger, broad-shouldered, his suit sharp, but his smile cruel. Clara had met him briefly at the gala, where his eyes had lingered on her with disdain. "Alexander," Gregory said, voice dripping with false concern, "we need to discuss your wife." Clara stiffened at the word, but Alexander's gaze narrowed. "Say what you came to say." Gregory smirked. "Everyone knows this marriage is a farce. A nurse plucked from obscurity, suddenly wearing diamonds? Do you think the board will stand by while you hand your empire to a gold digger?" Clara's face flushed hot, her fists tightening at her sides. Before she could speak, Alexander's voice cut through the air like steel. "Careful, Gregory." But Gregory only leaned closer, lowering his tone. "The shareholders are already restless. They will not tolerate a scandal. If this contract is exposed, you could lose everything. Perhaps that is what she wants." His eyes flicked to Clara, filled with contempt. The words stabbed deeper than she expected. Clara wanted to shout that she had never asked for any of this, that every choice she made was for her mother and brother. But the doubt, the cruel suggestion that she was a parasite, clung to her. That evening, as she sat alone in her room, the storm outside beat against the windows. She stared at her sketchbook but could not draw a line. Gregory's words echoed in her ears. Gold digger. Scheme. Scandal. When Alexander came to find her, she tried to mask her turmoil, but he saw through it. "Do not let him shake you," he said firmly. "Gregory has always hungered for power." "But what if he is right?" Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "What if everyone sees me as a fraud? What if I am dragging you down?" Alexander's jaw tightened. "Clara, listen to me. You are not here to take from me. You have given me something no board member, no relative, no fortune could provide. You gave me a reason to keep fighting." His words steadied her, but she knew Gregory was not finished. A storm was coming, one that could tear down everything they had begun to build. And for the first time, Clara feared that love, fragile and unspoken, might not be enough to survive it. The board meeting was supposed to be routine, but Clara sensed the tension long before they entered the glass tower downtown. The elevator ride was silent, Alexander standing tall in his tailored suit. Clara by his side with her hands clasped tightly in front of her. His health had improved enough to allow him back into the business world, but his face was still pale, his body thinner than before. She worried the confrontation ahead would drain what strength he had regained. The conference room was filled with sharp suits and sharper eyes. At the head of the table sat Gregory, his smirk hidden behind a mask of professionalism. He rose as Alexander entered. "We are glad you could join us," he said smoothly. "But there are matters of grave concern." "Oh." Alexander's gaze remained steady. "Then let us hear them." Gregory spread his hands. "It is no secret your health has declined. And now you have introduced instability into this company. A marriage born of convenience to a woman with no background, no pedigree. Investors are nervous. Some believe you are unfit to continue leading." Gasps rippled around the table. Clara's stomach dropped, but Alexander's expression did not waver. Gregory's voice grew louder. "If this marriage was nothing more than a contract, if you staged it to secure sympathy or distract from weakness, then you have endangered us all. We demand transparency, or step down." Clara's heart pounded. Every eye in the room was on them. She felt the weight of the gold band on her finger like a brand. For a moment, Alexander said nothing, the silence stretching unbearably. Then he pushed himself to his feet, his frame trembling but his voice clear. "You want transparency?" he said. "Yes. Our marriage began as an agreement. I will not lie. But what you call weakness has been my greatest strength. Because of Clara, I am alive today. Because of her, I found reason to rise from that hospital bed. If that disqualifies me, then so be it." He turned toward Clara, and for the first time, his voice broke past the polished armor. "She is not a fraud. She is not a gold digger. She is my wife, and she is my choice." The room fell silent. Some looked stunned, others uncomfortable, but none dared to interrupt. Clara felt her throat tighten, tears blurring her vision. Alexander had just risked his empire to defend her. He had turned their secret arrangement into a public declaration. Gregory's face darkened, but the momentum had shifted. A few board members began to nod, murmuring approval. One elderly director cleared his throat. "If Mr. Carter says this woman gave him strength, then I, for one, will not question it." The meeting ended without a vote, the challenge temporarily dissolved. But as Alexander led Clara out of the room, she knew the battle was far from over. Still, one truth had been spoken aloud in front of the world. Whatever had begun as a contract was no longer just business. For the first time, Clara felt not like an imposter in Alexander's world, but like someone truly standing beside him. And that realization left her breathless. Weeks passed after the confrontation at the boardroom, and slowly the storm began to quiet. Gregory's accusations lost their bite once Alexander returned to work with steady determination, and investors regained confidence. Yet for Clara, the true change was not in the business pages, but in the way Alexander now looked at her without walls, without calculation. One afternoon, Clara was called to the west wing of the Carter estate. She followed the butler through long corridors until he opened the doors to a gallery she had never seen before. The room glowed with soft light, the walls lined with frames. Clara froze when she realized what they held. Her sketches. Every drawing from her worn sketchbook, her mother's hands. Matthew bent over his books. Even the Carter estate, each one had been mounted, preserved, displayed as though they were priceless art. At the center, a plaque read, "The Art of Clara Carter." Clara's breath caught. Her fingers shook as she reached toward one frame, hardly believing what she saw. Behind her, Alexander's voice carried through the room, steady and warm. "You once told me no one looked closely enough to see your work. I want the world to see what I see." Tears stung her eyes as she turned. Alexander stood in a dark suit, healthier now, his frame stronger, his color returned. In his hands was a small box. He walked toward her, each step deliberate. "Clara," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "We began with a contract. I asked you to stand by me when I was certain my days were numbered. But you gave me more than survival. You gave me life. And now, I do not want a contract. I want a marriage built on love, on truth, on us." He opened the box, revealing a ring far more beautiful than the simple band she wore. "Will you marry me again? This time for real?" Clara's vision blurred with tears. Her chest ached with joy and disbelief. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Yes, Alexander." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and for the first time, the smile that spread across his face reached his eyes fully. He pulled her close, holding her as though letting go would be unthinkable. Months later, beneath a canopy of roses in the estate gardens, their second wedding was small but filled with warmth. No contracts, no notaries, no whispers of scandal, only vows spoken with open hearts. Clara looked at Alexander as they exchanged rings. No longer the dying billionaire, but the man she had come to love. And when the officiant declared them husband and wife, Alexander leaned close and whispered, "This time, forever." Clara smiled through her tears, knowing that what began as survival had become the truest mistake of fate, the kind that leads not to ruin, but to love everlasting.